Humans have a complex relationship with animals. Today, our society is heavily dependent on animals as a source of food, as assets to agriculture practices, as methods of transportation, as a source of entertainment, as a vital component to science and research, as assistance to people with disability, as monetary objects, and as forms of protection. Not to mention, we have relied on pet animals for companionship since the 19th century and practiced animal worship since ancient Greece. Animals are prevalent actors in just about every aspect of our daily lives, but there is a huge disconnect between the role that animals play in our lives and the respect that we give animals in return. For the most part, we view animals as pawns of human survival and progress. However, this modern mindset is not the only one that exists today. Indigenous people have a significantly different relationship with animals compared to the modern human. Though indigenous people do still rely on animals for food, agricultural assistance, transportation, warmth, just as other humans do, their beliefs regarding the value and importance of animals in the grand scheme of existence juxtaposes our modern industrialized mindset of over-exploitation and betterment of humanity. Interconnectivity is one of those beliefs that stem from indigenous people that modern society does not inherently practice. Interconnectivity is the belief that everything in the universe, including animals and humans, are connected to one another. According to Indigenous Corporate Training Inc., the spirit world is connected to the mortal world, the sea is connected to the land, and the sky is connected to the ground. Connectivity explains the connection people have to their communities, their traditional territories, and the ecosystems on those lands. This mindset is not technically mutually exclusive to Indigenous people. But interconnectivity is not a concept that we raise our children on like indigenous people do. This idea of interconnectivity encourages a relationship of coexistence between people and animals rather than the exploitation of animals that we practice in modern society. To better understand this idea, I encourage you to think of indigenous communities as a part to a greater whole. They exist within the ecosystem around them. On the other end of this idea, we have modern humans who see themselves as the greater whole, and our surrounding ecosystems exist to serve us. Another concept that speaks to the close relationship indigenous people have with the natural world is the 7 teachings. The 7 teachings are a set of values represented by animals that people teach and follow. According to the Southern First Nations, each community has adapted the teachings to suit their community values. Despite where the teachings may have originated, they share the same concepts of abiding by a moral respect for all living things. As the graphic shows, the eagle represents love, the beaver represents wisdom, the buffalo represents respect, the turtle represents truth, the wolf represents humility, the elusive Sasquatch represents honesty, and the bear represents courage. The fact that the 7 teachings are represented by animals speaks to a concept that we talked about in the lecture about animals as symbols, which was bestializing people and humanizing animals. The 7 teachings do both of these things. It attributes human characteristics to animals while acknowledging that these animals are the ones who teach us about these characteristics in the first place. If anything, the 7 teachings really show that indigenous people have a deep-found respect for animals. This isn't to say that a modern person doesn't do this. As we learned in the same lecture, this is a typical human mindset. The difference is that indigenous people have raised generation after generations to think this way. It's a core part of indigenous identities. Another interesting facet of indigenous relationships with animals are their sustainable and respectful hunting methods. A quote that really captures the indigenous hunting mindset says that indigenous hunter-gatherer societies treat other animals as fully sentient beings, which have equal status to humans, and must be shown respect even when they are hunted. This mindset is virtually absent in the modern sense. Large-scale meat sourcing in our capitalist society views our food animals as just that, food and nothing more. The general treatment of the vast majority of animals which reside within the agricultural, fishing, and pharmaceutical industry belie a disregard of animals as sentient creatures. Historically, the meat industry is a horrifying display of animal abuse and exploitation because we don't, as a society, hold the same level of recognition and respect that indigenous people do. Thinking back to the At the Fork documentary, we'll remember that the treatment of animals is subpar at best for larger meat factories. For example, egg factories are ridden with nightmarish practices, such as battery cages, where chickens can't walk at full posture, they have nowhere to perch, lay eggs, or scratch. The reality of this is brutal, but we don't even look at the brutality of it because it's an efficient and large-scale food source for us. This would never be allowed in an indigenous community because they value animals as being equivalent to people. One indigenous group that reflects this idea of hunter-animal respect is the Yupik Eskimo of Alaska. They believe in the reciprocity with animals. That is, that animals will only give themselves to hunters who hold a deep respect for them and recognize them beyond the sustenance they will offer. Further, the Yupik people aren't forced to outsource their food. Rather, they live off the land they reside. Because they were semi-nomadic people, they could move wherever their food goes with the season. With a small population size, sustainable food sourcing is far more realistic, of course. But the main difference between the Yupik people and modern Western society is the mindset behind our food. Since making contact with modern Western society, Yupik lifestyle has changed. While many aspects of their life has been modernized, it's their core beliefs and practices that keep the indigenous group alive. Some families still practice traditional hunting practices as well. That respect for the land and ability to coexist among wild animals in the natural world is not something that has been lost to them. If anything, the modernization of their territory has encouraged them to keep those beliefs alive even more. Animals within certain indigenous communities also hold deep spiritual significance for indigenous religions. One of these spiritual concepts is animism, which we talked about back in week 2. Animism is the belief that non-humans, such as animals and plants, are not only lively, but can be understood as persons, that is, as beings with an interest in their own life, their own way of life, and their own desires. A simplified way to look at this is that humans, animals, plants, and land all share the same spirit, but reside in different physical forms. Ideas such as animism are virtually non-existent in the modern world. But these ideas are the very reason that indigenous people are more connected to the natural world than modern Western society. Again, referring back to the social construct lecture, we can recall that the divide between humans and animals today is a social construct that is not universally found. The widespread non-Western understanding of animals and people is that we are more connected than we tend to believe. We've since replaced animism with ideas like speciesism, in which humans believe that we are superior beings compared to all other things. The term speciesism was originally coined by English philosopher Richard Ryder in the 70s, and later popularized by Australian philosopher Peter Singer. The graphic here represents the difference between animism and speciesism. On the left side is a hierarchical pyramid that we recognize in Western culture, and on the right side depicts a relationship of coexistence that is recognized in indigenous cultures. This idea of speciesism can be traced back to Greco-Roman classical thought and biblical notions of creation, but has become ingrained in our society. Animism is the complete opposite of this, and many indigenous groups still believe this today, despite having contact with the modern world. The major takeaway of all this is that indigenous communities have a more symbiotic relationship with animals than modern Western society. We've become severely disconnected from the natural world, and I believe that the revitalization of indigenous thought would encourage us to lead more sustainable lifestyles. The preservation of interconnectivity, the 7 sacred teachings, sustainable hunting practices, animism, and the indigenous lifestyle overall are all factors that contribute to the lasting mutual relationship between indigenous people and the natural world. Juxtaposing indigenous people, modern Westerners have commodified animals to the point that we no longer even recognize many animals beyond their monetary value. This divide was created by us, and we are just as capable of redefining our relationship with animals.